Veronica, thank you so much for joining today and for your willingness to bring your expertise to this interview. So, just a brief introduction. Veronica, she is an agriculture scientist as well as a naturopath, founder of Root Cause Clinic, and CEO currently. So, I really am looking forward to her extensive knowledge behind a lot of these phenomena that we see in dance movement therapy, bringing the scientific background. So, Veronica, I would love if you would just explain a little bit about who you are, what you do. My guess is a lot of people won't have really much of a context for Root Cause Clinic, the work with the bioresonance, all of that. So, would love an explanation.
Sure, absolutely. So you're right. What we do is a bit different, although if you ask us, it's definitely the way of the future. Frequency is the future. So with that said, we're identifying and evaluating with our own markers, our own biomarkers, if you will, but they're electro biomarkers. So, the body electric. This is essentially not really referring to what you might think it might be, which would be neurons. I mean, that is electrical processes as well, but we're actually testing the quantum field of individuals. So, just as that we are able to measure frequency in many different types of value systems, if you will, like, using sonogram and using, an EKG, for example, even a PET scan. These are all dealing with forms of the atomic level in which that we're assessing, the human form. So at RCC, we're using mostly Hertzian-based frequency to analyze the electromagnetic field of a person. This is what we believe to precede the biochemical being your standard blood work, et cetera. A lot of times, many people will go in and, they feel the symptoms before the lab work really shows that, right? So if we get to that point where the lab work shows that you're a little bit late, what if we can find what animates that? And that's precisely what we do by working with the physics level of health, because we believe that the physics actually, if you look at the periodic table of element, even if we look at that and we see chemistry, what's actually bringing that chemistry together, So that's in a nutshell what we do. Of course, I could take that down a rabbit hole for a couple of days.
Yes, thank you so much for that explanation. I think I also agree that this is such a huge thing that we can start to bring to the forefront of science, of the medical field, also mental health. And so that's really that mental health piece is especially where I want to hone in on today, since that's really where the work that I'm coming from is stemming, is that mental health piece. So I've heard a lot just through hearing your talks, following Root Cause Clinic, also experiencing it for myself about the connection between thoughts, emotions, the electromagnetic field. Could you really touch on that? So how do you see those show up in the scan? How are the thought life and the emotions related to what comes up when you do these testings with people?
Sure, that's a great question, because sometimes there's quite a bit of confusion about it. Comes up really accurate for people, and they're like, I don't understand how you got this information. So first we'll assess kind of how this works in general. Essentially, to study the body physiologically speaking, just as you would have the ability to use, let's say, DNA to tag what does a liver cell look like? What does, Bartonella pathogen look like? What does, imbalance in the lungs look like? All of this is, categorized just the way that we have tagged DNA, so to speak. We have tagged Hertzian frequency to be allocated to specific, whether it's, organ systems or tissues in the body, or this is, some sort of pathogen or some sort of chemical. It all has its own Hertzian value, and a Hertzian value is a specific numerical value for the frequency. We can get into all that physics if you want to later, but essentially we're tagging that using frequency instead of using biochemistry. Now, the same thing can happen when we're talking about emotions, and that happens because emotion is the outward expression of a feeling, but the feeling first begins with the thought, right? And so that thought generates energy. We can actually measure the way that an electromagnetic field or energy is created from a thought alone. Many people are familiar with brain waves. It's somewhat similar. It's a little bit different. We can actually also look at those as well. But by being able to see differences in different thoughts, we've actually been able to map specific Hertzian frequencies for specific thoughts. So the type of vibration or Hertzian frequency that we can calibrate for something, let's say, such as depression, we see a difference between that and happiness, or versus joy, or versus fear. Now, those are very just simply stated emotions, but there's also a much deeper level we can go. If somebody thinks about their mother, there's a specific type of pattern and calibration of frequency that comes up for that thought process, as is for someone's job, as is for somebody feeling a lack of confidence. We can also see where this is held in the body, because depending on that actual frequency, meaning let's say if something's at 432 hertz, well, wherever that we might similarly find 432 hertz in the body or some sort of tissue that could be similar, that will be under the principle of like attracts like, an area where we might tend to store specific emotions. So if you've ever heard about the liver stores anger, for example, or the lungs store grief, or we store sadness or heartbreak literally in the heart, that is going to be kind of the premises of how that can actually work. And, when we talk about, how certain gemstones and crystals will have their value, that's also going to be how that works. It has its own vibration as well. Does that vibration actually match up with, let's say, what the heart's natural electromagnetic resonance or vibration is? Because if so, then that has a balancing effect. So whenever you hear things such as, this crystal is good for that, and you're like, well, who decided that? They just make that up or what? No, if you really understand the science behind it, you can totally use this. We tend to not really like to apply the science part of this to the natural field. For some reason, they like to take away the value or the insight in our field. But if you take and you look at crystals, I mean, what do people think that their cell phone is working with? So the conductivity potential of what they're able to do in the interaction speaks for itself. But the rest of the world is still kind of catching on to how this applies to the body electric.
Yeah, so those connections, you really start to see how emotions and the physical body interact with each other, and you can't separate them either medically or in the mental health field as well. So keeping in that vein too, how do you see emotions and trauma impact the body? Like, where do you see, I know that could be very broad in a lot of places, but just wherever you want to take that, how trauma impacts, whether it's looking at things that get dysregulated, organs or otherwise.
Sure. Yeah. So we definitely see something of emotional significance on every single client. Sometimes people will tend to think emotional trauma has to be some sort of, extreme version of some sort of horrific event that happened to people. But really, a trauma or even something emotionally significant can mean just something that has shaped your mold and your outlook and your view of life, because that's going to change how you filter information. So the way that information is filtered into the body is not just, something that's going to be emotional and that goes into one bucket and then something goes into the physical bucket. You can get into the anatomy of, how, let's say, what we sense from the electromagnetic field from the heart, which is actually the biggest electromagnetic field that we have of the body, much bigger than the brain. The brain actually has way more neurons, but guess what? It doesn't conduct the electromagnetic field that the heart does. So it's funny because we can get into even talking about some scripture where we talk about, God refers a lot about to knowing our heart. And he refers a lot to all the intelligence that the heart really speaks about, but yet we separate that with, conventional medicine. So we're here to say that there's not really a separation. In fact, if anything, that's the original first creation. The heart beats before the brain is developed. So this should speak to something. Maybe this is the original brain. But with that said, being able to see how that's something that we would come and filter from our electromagnetic field of the heart, whether it's, picking up on someone else's, vibes that may be kind of, maybe showing a little bit of anger or, some emotions that kind of make us feel a little bit off edge. How can we say that that does not affect us? We walk into a room and the vibe of the room, meaning literally how people are conducting themselves, acting, their sentiment, that will immediately cause a change on us. To what degree, of course, we have our own conscious will to exert our own and create our own energy with our own thoughts. And so that's all an interaction that happens and balances between the two. But that's going to be what we call an interference, right? It's a interference into your electromagnetic field. So that's going to shape the outcome as a whole. Now, if you're putting in emotional stimuli, and that's being filtered first through the electromagnetic field of the heart, this actually speaks with the brain, the cephalic brain, right? This is where we have all the thinking. And essentially that's the refractory that tells the body, like, this is all the stuff out there in the world. And this is kind of how we make sense of this, right? At the end of the day, though, it's literally the heart who gets to trump the brain. So if the brain says, okay, thank you, heart, for telling me this, but I see this, I would like you to go ahead and take this action. The heart can say, trump card, not doing that. So when we kind of try to just think problems out all the time and ignore specifically the value, and it doesn't mean you just go around, on pure emotion and lack any type of input from, the thinking process. There's a reason why that we have both of these, in the human body. And we're multidimensional, but that is a way that we can literally see emotion, if you want to talk the physics level, come into and influence not just the emotional sphere of health, but the physical, because when that heart receives that particular electromagnetic input, it's going to report to the brain. The brain's going to make decisions. And yes, the heart will have a final say, but the nervous system is going to be intricately entwined into our emotional state. And we can see that. So much autonomic nervous system dysfunction these days. And why is that? I mean, if you really look at the correlation with a lot of mental health statistics, and we actually start looking at the nervous system as well, you'll find a correlation that is statistically relevant, let me tell you. So emotional health really is, I think, the way that most people need to go the way of the future, because it helps us to understand, not just understand our physiological issues and problems that we may be having in the current, but how did we get to that point? Because understanding what input took you there helps you to know how to avoid that and where to prevent. And that's really what we should be looking at. We need to say, not just how do I make this disappear? That's buying you time. That's appeasement of the body and the mind. You have to look back and you have to say, what got me here? Reverse engineer your health, emotionally, physically, spiritually, because that's how you can truly get down to the foundation.
Yes, so that connection, it's so mind blowing when you start to get down into the science because it's all there. So I think one of the connections that I've really started to see in my own research is the vagus nerve and how that really starts to bridge the gap between the physical and the emotional. So how do you see that show up in your work, the vagal tone, all of that, and how it impacts people?
Sure. So, I mean, there's so many ways we can discuss that, but I mean, as a physiological kind of baseline, the vagus nerve, that's going to control a lot of our parasympathetic function. And if you're into polyvagal nerve theory, then you'll be well aware of that. And anybody listening will kind of know about that. But one of the things that we see is that there is an emotional component to that. Not many people talk about that, as far as what makes us want to be sociable and what makes somebody go into that mode that's, relaxed enough to speak in front of a crowd and, to enjoy company and all of this that we have evolved with as, tribal societies into communities. And of course, that's the portion, the ventral portion that we talk about with polyvagal nerve theory, that is kind of the more evolved portion of the parasympathetic. And then we get into the more primitive, which was literally that play possum, or the dorsal dominant portion. That was kind of like, if sympathetic nervous system dominance, extreme fight or flight didn't work, and you had to kind of conserve resources and hope, well, maybe this will spill over and I'll get a chance to, run away from this later at some other point. That was actually the beginning of how we really developed. It was just those two. We evolved later with this ventral portion, but sometimes I see an issue with being able to tell the difference between somebody in a sympathetic state, meaning true fight or flight, or somebody who's locked into dorsal dominance, which is literally that paralyzing type of fear. Think of that possum who's so traumatized and overwhelmed that he's playing dead. Okay. So that is one thing that we can see with our testing. And a lot of times we will be able to link that to specific emotions on the emotional test. And the patterns that I see tend to be the people who will have a lot of that with not speaking up, so not being able to voice their opinions, not being able to even maybe feel that they are validated enough to have opinion worth expressing. So there's a lot of times there's some self-value, self-worth issues, et cetera. And if we really look at that, some interesting things that we see is, the Waldau's ring here, where we have a lot of that tonsillar tissue, that actually is lymphatic tissue. And one of the things that lymph tissue tends to kind of accumulate in the terms of emotions is the frequency of the lymph tissue tends to attract the kind of lack of self-value or insecurity issues that one might be able to kind of generate. So we tend to kind of hold that in the lymphatic tissue. And if you think about that, the throat is also where the ability to speak is projected, right? So that directly literally does tie into the vagus nerve as far as physiologically and, speaking, gag reflex, everything that you have going there. And oftentimes we'll a lot of times see that will impact the person's ability to control and have balance within. And again, we can get into autonomic nervous system function. It's some things that we can't control, so to speak, but they are not able to regulate and have homeostatic balance to have a life where that they can separate stressful situations from, being something that paralyzes them and doesn't allow them to function in life, versus okay, this is a stress. It's, something I have to deal with, and then to be able to mobilize forward. So those are some of the most common things that we see. A lot of self, worth issues tied into the lymphatic system, the throat, as far as being able to speak up. A lot of times we'll see, especially with women, the throat chakra comes up a lot. It's interesting that women have a lot more thyroid issues than we see represented with men. And if you take the emotional connotation to that, society does tend to tell women, maybe take one for the team. You're a caregiver, you're a mother, and the roles that we play in society. And I'm not negating that any of that should or shouldn't be a certain way, but women are going to be ones that typically are maybe not going to be as boisterous as maybe a male would be. Does this create a condensing of energy that is perhaps skewing the ability of this tissue to have homeostatic function? Therefore, does when we meet a pathogen or a chemical or something that comes in at the physiological level, the physical level, to skew this, we've already kind of had a sitting duck of an issue to where we come in ripe for the taking. So that's kind of, I would probably say, some of the more interesting connections or habitual ones we see come up in scans. But really, I've seen some amazing connections. I mean, I also believe that there's, the gut brain. And so it just really depends where that somebody has their weak link. Maybe somebody has had emotional trauma, but maybe they look like they're the most put together person. They're not having panic attacks or breakdowns, but guess what? This person can't digest their food. And if we really think about that, I had a person who didn't respond to, we did all the parasite work, we did all the, gut mucosa work, probiotics, digestive enzymes, I mean, using enema, everything, right? And this person wasn't making headway. I know that they had a lot of emotional trauma. So when we really started doing the work on that, also doing a lot of vagus nerve work with the frequencies that we plug in specifically for that portion of the vagus nerve, this person for the first time started digesting their food. Why? If we really think about it, because again, they were having the food come out, I mean, pretty much intact. The food went through them. The digestive system wasn't working. So when they were able to digest this emotional trauma that they had, and to get through that and process that, they were able to digest their food. So if you look at that, many people thought this person had it all together and they're a great person, but inside there was this shackled servitude to this emotional trauma. And while that person didn't break on the emotional spear, their weak link was the gut. So between the communication of the gut brain, the heart brain, and the cephalic brain, or the brain as we would think of it, that person, between the communication of all this, that trauma that kept coming from some other place, which was, the emotional or the electromagnetic field of the heart, and where that was stored, it had its repercussions in the gut. And that's another thing, is that where we'll have an issue surface, where we get the symptom, that's just the messenger. That really, it can be the same places where that the person or the writer of the message is also taking place. But a lot of times it's not. The people who fall in the chronic illness model, they're going to be the people that their problem and what we call the provocation aren't in this nice, neat, tidy little box altogether. Because if so, conventional medicine usually finds that, because they do organ system by organ system medicine. You go to the neurologist, he's going to look at all the nerve stuff. But if your problem exists a hair outside of that neurological sphere, then you know what? It's either there's nothing there or it's all in your head. So, by being able to see the body interconnected at this level, we're able to really reverse engineer and get back from where we see the problem, which is basically what the client's reporting as, these are my symptoms, and then what comes up on our technology, because that's telling us electromagnetically at the most sensitive level, before things could even be potentially physically presenting, where are those problems coming from? And so at that point, what we have to do, whether it's physical or emotional, we have to backtrack that. We have to be able to say, how does this symptom become explained by this area of the body? Sometimes the connections aren't obvious, but if you look and you do the research, you'll be able to find the connection. That's how we break the cycle of this organ system by organ system medicine, which is failing many.
Yes, and it's really cool. I see a lot of these connections. I work in substance use and trauma recovery and an inpatient, and so you really see on a very extreme level how this dysregulation occurs, both emotionally. There's a lot of trauma in that setting, as well as physiologically from substance use, and so you really see in a very prominent way that the gut brain connection and that dysregulation going. So we get to do so much work, body-based work, on how do you come back into the nervous system in a way that you can safely engage with people through that polyvagal lens of bringing the symptoms down out of fight or flight, or coming up out of that dorsal vagal place of complete shutdown. So it's amazing that there are these connections that you can really tap into physiologically, and also to just that story of how the emotions were impacting even just the ability for a person to have a functioning digestive system. You think how powerful that is, and it shows that a lot of these issues we see showing up in the conventional medical setting really do need to have a more creative outlook on how they're presenting, and as well as how to treat them. So um, earlier you were mentioning a bit about the Hertz frequencies, and I really wanted to tap into that because dance movement therapy really believes in the power of rhythm, using the biological rhythms as well as music as an intervention. However, I haven't heard a lot in that field on maybe some of the science behind that. And I know you talk a lot about frequencies, the specific resonant frequencies. So if you could tap into maybe the science behind why rhythm and frequency can actually be an organizing force for the body, that would be really amazing.
Absolutely. So you're correct that, frequency isn't just some sort of one size fits all. Frequency is literally in everything. Frequency is vibration, right? Oscillation. That is energy, really, if we're talking about that. So you can have energy delivered via Hertzian stabilization, which we load a frequency into something that can carry that, such as, let's say, an alcohol base like a tincture. Frequency is also something that we can apply via photons, right? Via light form, light wave, essentially. You can also use, like you mentioned, sound, which is going to work off of a slightly different kind of wave. So when you talk Hertzian wave, that's literally that wave that you look like that goes like this, right? Up and down. You have a crest and a trough, and basically it looks like that standard type of modality that we might imagine when you look at something like an EKG, something that's climbing up and down, etc. Now the longitudinal wave, which is how sound will work, is a bit different. That's actually going to travel. Imagine you have like a slinky, and you kind of pull that slinky out. So you have these, circular perturbations, which a perturbation is a push forth of energy, essentially, right? But it's not really traveling as a wave, so to speak, as what we talked about with that Hertzian wave. And Hertzian wave is going to be calculated based on the amount of times that we see that go up and down, essentially, per second. So when something has a higher frequency, obviously that's a lot more, wavelength, so less space that we're having in between that, as opposed to longer wavelengths, lower vibration, you're going to see that go at a slower pace. And just like anything, too fast, too slow, it's about having just right. And different things require different just right points. And so that's kind of where we do the biohacking with the frequency, because just because that something may be high doesn't mean that that's good. Even coming back to polyvagal nerve theory, oxygen is considered to be something that is necessary and we need it, and it can actually be great in recovery because this can actually help to trigger neuroplasticity, for example, that we use this, right? And we can use this also to, help with killing pathogens. I mean, the list is endless, but the emission state of which we're actually discharging, our waste products, and the balance between carbon dioxide and oxygen. It's not like that it's just, oxygen's the hero and this is all great. You actually need that subtle rise of that carbon dioxide to be able to trigger the next response for breathing. And it's actually been shown that the carbon dioxide, and don't get this confused that I'm telling people to all go get some carbon dioxide, but it's about the balance. When that actually starts to hit a certain point, we do actually trigger some relaxation potentially, or inhibit things such as tachycardia. So all that, old age kind of breathe into the paper bag, et cetera, to kind of help somebody calm themselves down. There's a balance. That's what we strive for, is resonance. It's coming to a point where that there's that perfect meeting of harmony. And in fact, the Root Cause Clinic logo, it's actually based off not actually biophotons or anything to do with directly kind of what you might imagine us to be measuring or working with, but it's about resonant frequency being that spot where we come to the fact that, like a pendulum, whenever that we are idealized at the perfect amount of yield, we've hit that sweet spot where that we are functioning at that ideal level of energy transfer. That's what it's about. It's not about higher is always better, or low is bad. You need both, and you need that harmony. And that's what we're hoping to help people find, whether it's physiologically or emotionally that they originally come to us for. They both end up being something on the table that people realize they need to address. And one other story, actually, I forgot to mention it, that it's worth talking about when you asked about some stories for, tying in vagus nerve and tying in things. And I mentioned the throat. There was actually another story that we have where that there was an individual who her emotional scan yielded information about her father. Mind you, it was when, and we can actually see when in your life that this trauma is referencing. So we can see if it's something within, let's say, 21 to 22, or maybe something like between 40 and 44. It varies for everybody. But in this particular woman's scan, it showed a lot of trauma based around a relationship with her father. It showed things about school and, marital problems and everything. And turns out, in talking to her, essentially, she was taking care of her father, who was terminally ill with cancer. He moved in. She had just gotten married. So it's kind of stressful, obviously. And then she had to drop out of college. She was enrolled in a scholarship. And that actually, all had to go away because she was going to take care of her father. And many people would think, oh, you must have been able to spend so much time with them and you got those last, quality moments in with him. Not really. He berated her. He would insult her daily. He was cruel to her. One of the things that he would do is tell her to shut up repeatedly. Remember, referencing back to that, electromagnetic field of the throat and how that is suppressed, right? Your voice is taken. And also, he would tell her to go choke. He referred to her as Mama Cass. He would say, go choke on your ham sandwich. And so what this person literally heard in the form of words are a vibration as well. And that interchange that kept interfering with her electromagnetic field, that had repercussions on her health. Now, let me tell you, this client was seen as 20 years later from this experience. Do you know that she came to the clinic for a condition in which her esophagus collapses? She chokes. That is a physical condition that she can have. She can choke on food that she ate from 2 hours ago because the collapsing esophagus. Not to mention she has thyroid issues. So if you really look at that, this condition didn't, have the ability to move forward until that this person was realizing why that even had to have a seed in the first place that sprouted to what it became. So, we get stories like that all the time.
Wow, it really shows that it's not just this conversation that people have of this connection, but that it is so real. You see it in this testing, and I think if more people were aware that this was available, that this technology existed, we'd be able to really integrate these fields and help people really find that homeostasis in themselves. So thank you so much for those stories. That's, I think, really going to illuminate some of this science for people. So I think another topic that I wanted to bring in briefly too was this idea of the meridians. I've heard you speak on that too, and I was wondering, just from your perspective, kind of through a movement in the meridians, how those have an impact on both emotional and physiological states as well.
Oh, that's a wonderful question. I think that's applicable to, both you and I. The way that energy moves in the body is important to understand because that can help us put links together that don't seem to make sense otherwise. When we have these set of symptoms present and we just think of things again by organ system medicine, we're really losing the ability to connect the dots on something and to find a root cause. Because if you understand the way energy moves, let's say, for example, let's take the lung and the large intestine meridian, which I gave an example of the other day on my social media, is that somebody who might be exposed to, let's say, virus or COVID, and then they get that Wilder's ring, which is that tonsillar tissue, and that kind of flares up and the lymph there becomes something that's a bit challenged. Well, this can affect, again, especially since that would be, let's say, a respiratory pathogen, that puts a challenge on the lung microbiome in general. But with the way the energy transfers between the long intestine and the lung, this becomes subject to affecting that jurisdiction as well. So why are we seeing a raise in appendicitis, especially within our younger populations who don't have as developed immunological lymph in this particular area of the body? Because that's the way that energy transfers. Why is it the appendix and it's not the small intestine who sits on a different meridian? Why is it the appendix and it's not, some other portion of the body? Why are we seeing that connection? It's because that is the way that the energy chooses to move, or the partners and the pairing, the way that energy balances in the body. One of the things that they have shown in Chinese medicine is that the flow of energy, when it's just, going to come out this way through the arms, back up again, up through the head, down this way, up from the legs, up, back up to the chest. that has actually, with radioactive chasers, been proven to be the way that energy flows in the body. So we've been able to substantiate something that was, talked about 2000 years ago with modern day isotopes, right? So energy is really the foundation of everything, because if you can't understand the flow of energy in the body, then you're kind of looking at this puzzle box that's all shaken up. You don't even have the idea of what it's supposed to look like, and you're trying to put this together. Is it possible? Of course, but which option do you think is going to give you the best facilitated way of being able to conduct that and to do that? It's understanding the travel and what this is supposed to ultimately look like as a whole, and then you can put it together.
Thank you so much. Yes, it's these pieces that are talked about. They might be thrown around a bit as ideas, but then to have that explanation really brings so much more power to how even like this form of body-based psychotherapy can be used to really start the flow of energy and helping regulate the systems in the body. So I'm just wondering, based off of all your expertise, how you think that on that really scientific level, how movement may actually be impacting people as a form of psychotherapy.
Well, sure. I mean, we can look at even examples past, such as, Tai Chi, being able to impact with movement, how energy is going to be situated or flow within the body, and how that can improve a myriad of conditions, right? So one of the things that I also like to look at, aside from some of the examples that, I've given, is the way that energy needs to get balanced. So we have to create some sort of interference. And that's what really, when we talk like physics level, we say we need some sort of interference, like even a perturbation. When I talked about that slinky example for longitudinal wave, which travels a little bit differently than the Hertzian wave, that perturbation is literally an interference. It's a push of energy that's going to come forth, and it's going to interfere with the energy field of something else. So when we talk about the way that energy works in the body, we're going to have some sort of perturbation or push of energy to balance it if it's unbalanced. So if we have too much energy in one area and not enough in the other, especially with meridians, the way that they can become unbalanced. Let's say that we have way too much going on because we've overloaded the body in the spleen, and the way that the energy there is being directed is all for the spleen. Well, the spleen and the stomach and essentially the pancreas are all kind of on this, single energy meridian. So we then have to borrow from, right, what we give or what we should be giving to the stomach or the pancreas, et cetera, because spleen's hogging it all up. So how do we balance this so that everybody gets their equal share or their necessary share to be able to function? You're going to have to make some either, changes, of course, to what's causing that at the root cause level. But in balancing energy, you absolutely can use physical movement to be able to help move this. I mean, just from the actual mechanical standpoint of influencing the perturbation, which is the energy shift that we've talked about. So I think that that's a great way to do energy balancing. I think it's also important that, movement allows for the release of certain things. So in being able to release things that are not good at allowing energy to be in a homeostatic pattern, they're influencing, as we would consider in a non-homeostatic, interference, then that would be something we would want to get rid of too, right? Or doing things that are beneficial. So certain types of movements, I mean, think about the breath work that we've talked about with polyvagal nerve theory. You're doing a mechanical action, that is movement. That is literal physical movement in the physiology to create certain stretches and certain pulls and tugs on the body that are meant to signify certain action that directs energy in a certain way. So incorporating movement as medicine is just another portion of actually using frequency, if you really think about it, because your action of how you choose to move is going to put a perturbation, it's going to put a impact and interference into whatever it is that you're trying to augment. And you can do that positively or negatively, meaning you can do that to benefit human health, or you can do that in a way that's going to affect it in a way that we would consider not to be beneficial.
Yeah, I see that a lot. Even think about how posture and how that even impacts things like mood. And we really try to encourage clients to be aware of even how they're sitting, how they're standing, and how it impacts their states and how they have the power to state shift through even just how they're holding themselves or how they're breathing. So I really have not heard it put that way with the augmenting of those things that you're trying to shift, but that really is such a powerful way to put it. So as we're coming close to end of your time, I don't want to push that, but I would love for you to talk a bit about, if people are interested too in Root Cause Clinic, like how they can reach out to you, how they can look into the testing, like where they go for that.
Sure. So we are on Instagram. You can find a lot of our content featured there. We also have a website. So our website is www.rootcauseclinic.co. Instagram is at rootcauseclinic. And my own personal Instagram is at healthdoll.co. So those are some good places to kind of check out our content. As far as if you were interested to book, you'll want to head to the website. And essentially there's about, 2 or 3 options if you really want to kind of get in with RCC. We have, the one where you will deal with the practitioners directly if you're more into needing that kind of hand-holding relationship, personalized, protocols, support, email service, back and forth, all of that. That's with a practitioner that's in the adult package or child package if you are a pediatric client. And then there is the biophoton beginners. That one is essentially where that somebody kind of wants to come in, test the waters. They want to get that professional review, which we really recommend because our data is not yet considered standard of care testing. So we cannot print out the raw data from our technologies and give it to people and say, this is what you have, or this is what is going on. Now, when we're looking at things, are we able to find, in our opinion, everything and more than what you can find with conventional? Yes, we do see things because we see things as, the electromagnetic field would show them, which precedes the physical. But to be able to test in times such as these, where that, technologies and solution providers such as ours are outsourced or, extinguished, we have to be careful about that. So we really recommend dealing with the provider because they do have access to the raw data and they can interpret these things to a whole different level than if you were just to read the client report itself. However, if you weren't looking for even to, potentially commit to working with a provider, even for the sake of one appointment, you could just get the kit. You could get tested, see what your results say. And that would be just ordering a single kit. And you know what? You can say, okay, I think I can either self-navigate this and put these kind of dots together, or maybe now I see enough of a connection to say I do want to go out and get that, particular expertise in that private appointment to kind of take this to a whole other echelon. So those are the 3 real ways that you can work with RCC. We also have some kits. So people who want to kind of get all the things that you're going to need to take care of a certain issue, we have a parasite kit. So our Parasite Whispers kit will actually test you. It includes testing for the gut. Full service testing, not just for parasites, but also kind of, what kind of food allergies or the status of the gut, the terrain, all of that. We also have an emotional kit, which is going to be coming out, which you may find something particularly good for your audience. This is where we're going to have kind of a book club. We're going to have some professional speakers regarding energy and vibration and emotional healing and the intersection with that and the physical health. It's going to include some journaling. There's going to be a lot of activity, really building a community to support each other over a 3-month period. And that's going to be the emo kit. Comes with some crystal stone jewelry. And it also, of course, our, really esteemed emotional scan. So those are basically what we have going on right now. Much more to come though. I'll be releasing a, quantum medicine course here in the next year. So we'll be having that for people who maybe such as you want to learn this on that physics plane or want to learn how to work with our data. How do we make clinical significance out of that? It'll be available for whoever would like to learn.
That's amazing. So thank you so much. I'll be sure to put all of that information in the notes for people to find and check out. I would highly encourage it. It's been really helpful clinic for me to work with personally, and then professionally has really helped shape my research and all of that. So Veronica, thank you so much for your willingness to share some of your expertise on all of this. I really appreciate it. And I really hope in the years to come we really start to see an integration of these fields, the work that you do with what's currently being done in mental health as well, because I think it adds so much value and can really help people to address those root causes of things that they might have symptoms for, even on an emotional level, and not really know where they come from. I just see how that can help the people that I work with so much. So thank you so much.
Well, thank you for having me. I appreciated my time and look forward to, I believe we can all learn from each other. So look forward to learning from you and your practice and what you're doing in your field as well.
So much.